My name is Todd Kimball. I'll be your MC today. Happy Memorial Day weekend. I hope everyone is having a safe and happy weekend. And our reader today is Jamila.
I'll be reading today from Voice Catcher. Voice Catcher is an anthology of Portland area women writers. These days it's an online journal, and you can find them at voicecatcher.org. Today's piece is titled Mortality Smacks by Miriam Fetter. I've had a big season for mortality. A heart attack here, cancer there, a dead husband, a brain tumor, a slumped over driver. All these things have happened to people who somehow connect with my circle. Husbands of associates, friends of friends, colleagues. There's been serious illness. Some died, young people, my own age. They've left ill-prepared families and people like me, stunned and gaping, scrambling for a seat when the music stops, checking our rearview mirrors more frequently. I take inventory. The next funny feeling sends me to the doctor. You want to do an electrocardiogram? Sure. It's fine. Good. I'm growing into the dark circles I've always had under my eyes. I bet when people meet me, they no longer wonder why that young girl has such dark hollows. No, dark circles suit the territory. New aches, new pains, age sprinkles down on people and body parts randomly. I'm almost getting used to this older person I see in the mirror. Thigh dimples still shock me, but it's time to buckle up all belts, double down all vites, floss nightly, plan for the future, live like there's no tomorrow. Living well is the best revenge, isn't it? I can comfort the grieving, but I better not get swept up in the tide of sadness. I know that it's out there, and when it aims at me, it'll be a tsunami. I've made some time for comfort routines and rituals. I never used to allow myself routines. I thought they were each a little death, and they are. But now they seem a caring and loving gesture. I have a full pot of coffee in the morning, sometimes sitting down. There's a hot tub before bed. And when I leave my routines behind for travel or some other demand on my time, I miss them. Routines are like botulinum. They can kill, but just a little bit smooths away the harshness of every day. I feel liberation and creativity in this post-period period. The second shift ends. I've graduated from my responsibilities to a child in my home. Maybe I don't have the same kind of energy I once had, but I've come to grips with my plans and limitations. I'm not facing off against the whole world, just my little corner of it. I have some time myself. Not everyone will find this creative spot, this time for herself. It depends on a number of things, but health is a big one. Health will take some away, make some unable or too cautious. It will change some into taking care of the others. Okay, death, I see you. And your illness, disease, disability, breaks, pins, pains, aspirin, stents, stunts, rehab. Mortality smacks and it smirks. Made you look. My friend escaped this time, but has left a nasty welt across his cheek. I can tell this is the beginning of a process. I hope it's a long dance, a slow dance with warm clutches and sensible shoes. I can tell the music is going to shift to the minor key from time to time, unexpectedly. When the needle lifts with a scratch or a gouge, I'll have to run to grab a seat. Still, I can't keep looking at the chairs all the time. I need to learn new steps, lean into new partners, catch my breath, flash a smile, and improvise. Thank you.
Thank you, Jamila. Very heartfelt reading today. I think all of us can relate to that journey in life. This weekend represents an opportunity to reflect on the sacrifices that have been made by men and women who have served and fought for the United States, many of whom were our neighbors, family, and friends. The Vietnam Veterans of Oregon Living Memorial is a significant landmark and tribute to the sacrifices of those individuals in a place of healing for those who lived. We will look behind the scenes at how the memorial came to be, from the initial idea through the design process and construction. Today's presenter, Chelsea McCann, is a principal and the managing partner of the landscape architecture firm Walker Macy. Over her 20-year career, she has focused on projects with significant benchmarks for design excellence and sustainability, including some of the firm's most challenging site development projects. Her work has ranged from large-scale campus planning to active programmed public open spaces, cultural and historic landmarks, and waterfront development. Chelsea's projects are noteworthy for their transformative influence, complex conditions, design challenges, and the integration of innovative engineering and the arts. We are muted, so let's have a warm visual welcome for Chelsea McCann.
All right, thank you, everyone. I really appreciate being invited here today, and I appreciate the warm welcome. You heard a little bit about myself in that bio, but today, as I present the Vietnam Veterans of Oregon Living Memorial, I am going to be speaking more on behalf of my former partner, Doug Macy, who was the designer behind this. Unfortunately for all of us, Doug passed away in 2017, so I'm going to do my best to present his work and give you some insight into the design and vision, as well as the process that helped make the memorial come to fruition. So I'm going to attempt to share my screen here. So memorials and cemeteries, which go hand in hand, are places of remembrance, solace, and healing. They are places where we get to connect with our past and celebrate the lives of those that we have lost. Prior to the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, my firm, Walker Macy, had not done much of this type of work, but today memorial design has become a specialty niche within our office. Some of our works, and I'll click through a few of these, include the Willamette National Cemetery that you see here, where we did a significant amount of planning and development work as they've expanded over time. And here's one of their ceremonial spaces. We've worked for the Los Angeles National Cemetery, as well as state cemeteries in Flagstaff and Marana. And then we've also done more memorial pieces throughout the Northwest. This is just one example, and this is the Warriors Memorial that was developed for the Confederated Tribes of the Umatilla. So while much of our work is multifaceted, in my bio, I think a whole bunch of things were listed, everything from campus development to public open spaces and parks. Through that scope of work in landscape architecture, we're often asked to develop designs that do a lot of things for everyone. So they're really active spaces, but one of the wonderful things about cemeteries and memorials is that when we work on these kinds of projects, it's a chance for us to narrow our focus. It's a moment to kind of find calmness in ourselves, find inspiration in the subject that we are trying to capture, and tell stories and create quiet places where visitors can come and immerse themselves in their own memories, as well as within the beauty of nature. So all that said is, I say this a lot in my office, while doing memorial and cemetery work is not the major focus of what our firm does, because those projects are not as frequent. it is still my absolute favorite type of work. And so I'm excited to be here today to talk about the Vietnam Memorial. So as we get into the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, I want to sort of do my best to start from the beginning and why the memorial even happened. And so I want to step back to a time before it really even became an idea. So as you know, there's no secret that the Vietnam War was not popular in the United States. And as the war kind of continued, the frustration around the war itself, around the politics that were mixed up in it, that frustration often overflowed onto the individual veterans who served in the war. So while they were often called into service, either voluntarily or through draft, and they often gave up everything during that service. When they returned home, for those who did return, they weren't always welcome. In past conflicts, if you think about, say, World War II, or even more current conflicts, when veterans came home, there were parades or monuments, fanfare, or at least saying thank you for your service. And those were not words that were said to the veterans who served in Vietnam, even though their sacrifice was just as great as these others. So there was a real disservice being done to those individuals, regardless of how you felt about the war itself. On November 13, in 1982, the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C., which is what you see here, which was designed through a blind design competition. So designers were asked to submit concepts for the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, and no one knew who was submitting, but they selected this piece by Maya Lin, who at that time was in her early 20s. The piece that she created was very different from any memorial that had ever been designed before. It's a very striking sculptural element. It's carved into the earth, and it lists the names of the nearly 60,000 soldiers who were killed in Vietnam, or US soldiers who were killed in Vietnam. And it's engraved in polished black granite, kind of creates a V shape. The monument highlights the loss of American lives without any real context to distract visitors. So there's no fanfare around the war itself. It really just focuses on those names engraved in black. So today, many see the minimal nature of the monument as incredibly compelling in how it draws out very raw emotion. But at the time of its development back in 1982, the reaction was quite a bit different. Once people saw the monument revealed, many were upset about the design and felt it conveyed a very negative attitude about the war and lacked recognition for the soldiers that survived. You can go and research quite a bit more about Maya Lin's piece. She was actually called into Congress to defend her design, and ultimately some additions were made to the memorial. So if you're there today, there are some sculptural elements that were added as a secondary piece to kind of appease some of the individuals who were not happy with the original design of the wall. So at that dedication in 1982, a number of Vietnam veterans from Oregon were there for the dedication. I should actually click forward. So there's a close-up on Maya Lin's piece. And on the trip home, there were two, Jerry Perro and Ben Stanley, who decided to build a memorial for Oregonians. So they felt the impact of this big reveal of the memorial in DC and really felt that there needed to be something back home for our community, basically, to come and be able to heal. They knew the two of them weren't enough, so they recruited a number of folks along the way that included Carlos Ricketson, Mike Goldale, Doug Bomarito, and Dennis Kinzer. And together they founded the Vietnam Veterans of Oregon Foundation with the goal of creating a different kind of memorial that would honor the Oregonians who served in the war. As you can imagine, in the context of emotion around the world, the effort that these men were taking on was not an easy one. as so many in the community could not separate their fury over the war from the individuals who sacrificed everything to serve the country. Vietnam veterans were treated as villains when they came back, or in many cases, and now those villains were going to try to raise funds and support to memorialize the fathers, husbands, brothers, and friends who were lost. So they knew from the outset that they were taking on a big challenge, and so we have to respect their perseverance to really take that on and make it happen. So there is a website which I've shared, and I think Todd will share with you. I also have it at the end of this presentation that you can go to that talks about the entire process of how the group made this happen. And it goes into quite a bit of detail. I'm not going to get into that detail, but the summary is it took a bit of organization and some reorganization, but eventually a core group of 5 started to get some political support and build momentum. So knowing that they needed to help create a master plan and having seen the design competition that led to the memorial in DC, the group began considering how to approach this project. They did consider a design competition themselves, but while not everyone is in the design and world that I live in, I will say that design competitions are very expensive. There's a piece of, you have to do a big invite. Once you get teams coming, you typically offer them a stipend, even if they don't win, and then the winning team gets paid for their design work. Because the Oregon Memorial was going to be built on a shoestring budget, it was pretty quick that they decided a design competition probably wasn't going to be the right approach. So all of this was happening in 1982, and at some point in 1983, the foundation reached out to Doug Macy. Doug Macy was one of the founding partners of Walker Macy, and he was the landscape architect on the design team for Pioneer Courthouse Square. So at that time, Pioneer Square would have been under construction, and so he was kind of starting to make some waves locally. So they reached out to Doug, and while Doug had not served himself, he did know many who lost their lives, and was inspired by the foundation's vision for a living memorial that would serve as a place of remembrance and healing. The original idea being to honor the sacrifices of the Oregonians who served, or the original idea of the memorial was to honor those sacrifices of those who served without any focus on the controversies of the war itself. They weren't trying to sort of sell the war or try to make it into something it wasn't. They just wanted to create a place to heal the divide that had been created between the Vietnam veterans and their community. The design concept that Doug initially came up with the design concept in an effort to help the foundation really kind of generate more support and help with their fundraising. So the design concept that Doug developed was to create a memorial that would be focused on the service of the men and not on the war itself. The memorial is just as much, if not more, a place for the living than it is for the dead. It was a place for people to come to heal. It was intended as a place for people to find solace. And when thinking about the memorial in DC, the DC memorial is somewhat compressed. So if you think about those pictures we just showed, the big black wall, it's all sort of compressed into one area. And in many ways, it's taken in all at once. So it has a huge immediate impact. For the Oregon Memorial, Doug's intention was to create an experience that would reveal itself over a larger area, allowing visitors who come to the memorial to be immersed and move through it, each kind of element building upon the last, to sort of build the impact slowly and allow people to absorb and process the sacrifices, as opposed to kind of being faced with it all at one time. So these are just a few early sketches that I've dug out of our archives. And you can see in it just some kind of early conceptual ideas that Doug was playing with. There's a few notes in there to kind of trace some of his thinking as he was coming up with this original concept. So one of the early steps in developing the memorial was going to be to find a location. The process took several months of searching for the right spot, wanting someplace that would be fairly easy for people to get to. Felt like it would have an impact on a lot of people, would be able to easily visit it, not a place that was really challenging. After several months, they eventually did find a location. At that time, and I took this off of this upper photo, it's a little blurry, but I took it off of the foundation's website. But there used to be, which I have zero recollection of, but some other people may remember, there used to be a small golf course in Washington Park. And so here's a photo of it. And it was pretty underutilized at the time that they were searching. And so Doug, through his relationship with Portland Parks and Recreation, was able to secure the site for the memorial. So Portland Parks, upon understanding the design concept and what the group was trying to do, said that they would commit the site. If the foundation was able to raise the funds to make it happen, they could have the space. Of course, locating the site didn't necessarily mean it was going to be built, because there is all that fundraising that needs to happen, but it did mark a major milestone in making the memorial a reality. So just to pause on this slide for a moment, for those who aren't familiar with the memorial, this image over on the left is all of Washington Park. And if you look down in the bottom left corner, you can see the Oregon Zoo, the World Forestry Center, and just above the World Forestry Center, so just uphill of that, is the location of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. And this looks like this today, but we'll walk through it here in a moment. So with the site identified, the design team had the final element needed to really begin the design work. In landscape architecture, our work is really based on creating design spaces and in individual sites all over the earth. So every site, of course, is unique. So we draw inspiration from the environment, the vegetation, and the topography, and build that into the overall design concept. So Doug had those early ideas about a sequence and kind of an idea of what the memorial would be. But once he had a site, it allowed him to develop that idea further. So the sequence that he was imagining, and this is a early sketch that he did of the plan, and this is the plan as it exists today. And I will click through a few images that show the design refinement drawings that he did. But the early idea was to create a sequence that included a processional, where visitors would leave their cars and decompress from their daily lives at the arrival at the central garden. So Doug was someone who has always pushed that you shouldn't just arrive, get out of your car, and see the goal from that point. That you need to, especially in a very emotional place like this, you need to actually decompress. So his idea was that when you park and you leave your car, you actually can't see the memorial yet. You have to move through this linear space. Has these beautiful cherry trees, and you walk through that before you arrive at the garden. So it gives you a moment to be immersed in nature, to let go of your daily life and everything that's going on, and actually allow yourself mentally to get ready for the experience you're going to have. He imagined a central garden space and then a path that would climb up, and along that path at some point you would see the names of the Oregonians who lost their lives in Vietnam. So that site that you saw, if I went too far, if I back up a little bit and you look at what we have here as far as a golf course versus what Doug was imagining we were going to create, there was going to be some significant earthworks, a lot of moving of dirt around to actually achieve that bowl formed in this sloped hillside landscape. So With that site selected, the design was further developed through sketches and refinements. And these are some of the drawings that have been saved in our archives that show how the modifications of those original trace sketches that you saw that kind of had the yellow background, a few slides back, to where we are now to get to the final vision. And these were also drawn in such a way to be able to be used for fundraising, so they could be taken out and shown to people so that they could understand what they were potentially supporting. So this is a blow up enlargement plan view on the bottom of that processional idea of that moment of arrival and walking in that linear space. And then above it is an elevation that shows how that space might look with this kind of initial entry sign in this grove of trees. This is a section that we had through the bridge. So in the plan view below, you see the arching bridge, and you can see in the section above that how the processional slides under the bridge before you actually get to a point where you can follow a path and rise up onto it. And then these are some early sketches of what the memorial walls might look like, as well as some of the different ways to test and study what each of those alcoves could be. And I should say, you know, ultimately that processional detail, as it does rise 60 feet. So there's a 60 feet rise from that initial garden as you climb all the way up. There are 5 alcoves, and I'll show you some photos of these and how they actually look. But there are 5 alcoves, each of which is dedicated to a different stage or time frame of the war. And then a final 6th alcove at the very top, which is dedicated to those who are still missing in action. So part of the design team included Elizabeth Anderson. She is a graphic and environmental designer who specializes in signage, and Terrence O'Donnell, who is a historian and a writer. As part of the design, Terrence developed the writing that you do see on the memorial today, along with the names of fallen soldiers beneath the alcove. Terrence developed text that sometimes speaks to moments in the war, but more often described events back home, which is a really, I think, is a very striking way to approach this memorial, because it pairs up 2 versions of life. It highlights events that are sometimes social or political or just everyday moments that occurred around the state and affected the lives of those who stayed home, with moments in the war and the loss of Oregonians who were serving in the war. And so it starts to tie this war that people were upset about and it felt disconnected. It ties it back to lives that were being lived at the same time. The font that was designed for the memorial was designed by Elizabeth Anderson specifically for the memorial. It is named Hoyt, so they gave it that name, and it was immediately retired. So it has only been used on the Vietnam Veterans of Oregon Living Memorial, and that is the only place it will ever be used. So to make the design real required a significant amount of fundraising and volunteerism, and of course, unrelenting dedication from the foundation, who were absolutely focused on making this happen. If you read more about the project on the website, they talk about how hard it was to raise the funds for the project and how often they weren't sure if they could really make it happen. There were plenty of times when I'm sure they were feeling like this was an impossible mountain to climb. But there were a couple major tipping points along the way. Early, they did get political support from the mayor of Portland as well as the governor, and that gave them some significant credibility as they worked on their fundraising. But one of the biggest tipping points was when the foundation took the plans, they took all these designs to the Association of General Contractors to see if they would support the project. Many of the contractors were veterans themselves. And after the presentation, reportedly, they only took just a couple of minutes. They sort of asked everyone to leave the room so they could talk about it. They only took a couple of minutes to deliberate before fully committing to the project. they were able to rally volunteers from amongst their members to provide a huge amount of the construction effort, including the earthwork, at no cost. And that was really what was required to take this design that Doug had done and his friends had created to pro bono for the group, and then have so much of this construction effort be done as a volunteer effort as well, was a huge deal to actually make this something that could truly happen. The memorial was dedicated in November of 1987. The design is beautiful. It is nestled in the trees of the park, but it's also very, very personal. The sequence of spaces allow visitors to walk through history and make the connection between the parallel events, one for the soldiers and one for the people who are living their daily lives. I personally think it does an exceptional job of reminding us that regardless of your feelings about the Vietnam War, the individuals who served were loved and they sometimes gave their lives, and their service should be honored. So I want to walk through some slides that I took as we did our test yesterday. I revealed that some of our photos of the memorial were a little outdated. Some of them were not great quality. So I took my kids up last weekend to get some new photos, and luckily the weather was being agreeable while we were up there, and they had just were just wrapping up some cleanup on the gardens and just making it look its absolute best, because they of course do events up here at Memorial Day. So Portland Parks always puts a bunch of focus on it right around Memorial Day to just make sure it's top notch for those events. So this is so these photos, like I said, were a week ago. So this is the processional. So when you arrive, this is the area that you walk through. These are cherry trees on either side. So you can imagine earlier in the spring, those would be beautiful when they're in bloom. And you walk up and you arrive at the Garden of Solace. This is the central space of the Garden of Solace. There's also a small water feature. And this is kind of your first moment to really arrive, and just to read the inscription in case, I know it's small, but the inscription at the first sign says, "So long as we are not forgotten, we do not die. And thus this garden is a place of life." I get a little teary with this memorial because it is very connected not only to the incredible impact of how the team designed it, but also my relationship to the designer himself. Yeah, I got to see my friend Doug in this design. So as you rise up and move your way around the garden, this is that rising path. As I said, it rises a total of 60 feet. But you can see these folks were starting to arrive at the bridge as it climbs up over the garden. And when you arrive at the first alcove, the first inscription is written here. So while the war raged in Vietnam, day-to-day life in Oregon continued. Recorded on these panels, it's a random selection of happenings, momentous and trivial, comic and tragic, which took place in towns and countryside, which the men named here have come and would not see again. So that kind of sets the stage for what you're going to see. And then I have a photo from each of the alcoves. And as I said, each one is a portion of the war. So that first inscription that you saw, that I showed up on the screen, is this one furthest on the left. And then each of the following inscriptions continues to talk about events and happenings in the state. And in the final inscription, as they talk about those kind of current events, it also notes the first Oregonian, the date of the first Oregonian who lost their life. This is the second alcove. And so as time went on, you see the names increasing and the number of individuals who lost their lives. And then the inscriptions continue in the same way. By the third memorial, this is the largest one. And while we were there, actually, there was this lovely little family that was at this space. They were taking some photos of their family and had a printout of one of their family members out here. So it's really wonderful to see people continuing to come and visit the memorial and enjoy the space and be able to kind of have those moments of healing and remembrance. This is the fourth alcove and the fifth as the war began to wind down. And then, as I said, there is a sixth alcove, or sorry, this is the final inscription on the, so it's the, if you were looking at that last alcove, this is the inscription at the last point on the right. Such then were some of the happenings in Oregon during these years of war, events both brave and blithe, nonsensical and notable, spectacular and ordinary, the multitudinous life of a place which these 751 men were not to see again. And then as you rise up past that is the MIA Memorial. And so this is the sixth, it's at the highest point on the site. And it says just above these names, and these remain the missing in action in Vietnam, 11th November, 1987. And what you will see if you go up to visit is there is a little note that they add an asterisk each time that they find the remains of one of these individuals. And so there have been some that have been since been found that are on the MIA wall. And so with that, that is the Oregon Veterans Living Memorial. And I would gladly welcome questions and thoughts. Sorry, I'm shifting around my setup here just a little bit. There we go.
Thank you so much, Chelsea, for your work on the memorial and your tour with us today. It was very informative and very moving. Thank you.
Thank you.
I know with a project like this, you mentioned some of the challenges in fundraising and all the volunteers and people that were involved. So other than the project itself happening, what do you think was one aspect that Doug really had to fight for that he's most proud of with the memorial?
I don't know how much fighting he had to do, but I know I see his influence in how they connected the individuals who lost their lives with the daily life in Oregon. And I know that was a big deal for him because he did not serve in Vietnam. He had an injury that prevented that. But he knew many people who served. And I think, sometimes there's a sense of guilt, if you will, to be able to live your life and sort of be able to ignore what was happening overseas to some degree, or sort of compartmentalize it as an other thing. And so I think him tying together the life that he and others were able to live in the state while so many were sacrificing was being able to make that connection. So even today, you understand what they're trying to say. I think was probably the biggest piece of it for him, of creating that emotional and sort of mental connection for people between these two parallel worlds that were happening.
I keep thinking about the context of creating that project, and the details are interesting, but I keep thinking of the context, which is the Vietnam War. Should we have been involved in that at all? I was in Vietnam in a civilian job for 3 years, from late 67 to January of 71. And I went over there as a non-thinking, adventurous, reckless young guy. But by the time I left there 3 years later, I actually started to think about, why are we here? And it made no sense. Should we honor those people who lost their lives in a war that made no sense for our country? Yes. I mean, maybe even more so than honoring those who lost their life in the Second World War. Unfortunately, we did not learn the lesson we should have learned from involvement in Vietnam. Here we are still in Afghanistan, finally getting out Vietnam, we went there because we couldn't tolerate the idea of a communist government taking over. It actually wasn't our business. So anyway, thank you for your presentation. And you did basically, even though you went into a lot of details about the project, you did allude to the war, the context of our involvement there. And I thank you for that.
And I appreciate your comments, and I was too young myself to have really been directly impacted by it. Part of the war, I didn't exist. But I think that point of just because we shouldn't have been there, and I think a lot of people agree with that, does not take away from the sacrifice. The people who served weren't making the choice of whether or not we should be there. They were just trying to serve their country and to the best of their ability. And so it is heartbreaking to see the reception they got when they came home, but wonderful to see how much people have healed and tried to make up for those kind of mistreatments. You are correct that we are not good at learning our lessons, and I'm not sure how we do that. But at least we learned to honor our veterans a little better. And we see that even in some of the more recent conflicts that have a lot of disagreement. Those veterans are treated much better than the veterans from Vietnam were treated.
From Paul Pappas, I'll read that. He was in Vietnam for 18 months, and he said, is there any plan to honor and recognize the 2 million Vietnamese that were killed in the war at the memorial in some way?
Paul, I cannot speak to that. I do not know future plans. If there is anything along those lines, I think that might be a question worth bringing up or asking the foundation if that is something they would consider. Obviously, the focus in the development of this memorial was really only on the Oregonians. So it was really a very local focus. But whether or not that is something that could be added, I do not know. That would be wonderful to acknowledge.
Next, we have a question or comment from Sheila.
Thank you. Emotional as I am, as a rule, it's hard for me not to become very emotional when I tell you this. For years, I would drive through the park and see a sign that said Vietnam Memorial. It never occurred to me to pursue and see it. But about 2 or 3 years ago, I was volunteering one Saturday morning at the Forestry Center. And after that morning of volunteering, I decided to take a walk. And I came upon that sign that was an entrance to the memorial. Well, it looks like a place I could walk. I will walk in here, and now I know it's called the processional. I didn't know that at the time. And I was absolutely astonished at this magnificent place that was right under my nose all these years, and I'd never explored. So I began the walk. I walked up, I read the histories. I thought, what an amazing place, not only for the learning of history that was going on, not only in Vietnam, but here all over the country. And the brilliance of the conception knocked me out. So I walked to the top, and somewhere close to the top, I sat in the grass, and I have to admit I took a selfie or two. It was an extraordinary experience, and I cannot recommend highly enough that those of you who have not been there and who are physically able to take that walk, do it. It's absolutely worth the effort. I'm so grateful for this place in my city of choice for the last 15 years. And Chelsea, thank you so much for telling us how that happened. it's an astonishing story as well as a place. Thank you.
Thank you. And I second your recommendation. If you are able to get there and make the walk, it is definitely worth it. And as I said, I went up, took my kids up last weekend to look at it, and I hadn't been there in years. And I'm not an emotional person, and you already saw me get a little choked up once today. It is a very striking memorial.
We have a question from Al Christians. Al?
It appears that you've built something, according to your intentions, to give people some peace and some honor, and that's all you can do, and that's the best you could do, and that you've done it. But you kind of built a room with an elephant in it, the elephant being that war is the industrialization of death and misery on a grand scale, on a nearly global scale. And oh, by the way, there's nothing anybody has ever found out to do about it. From time to time, society just goes crazy and does this, get used to it. No, nothing to see here. We've avoided this controversy. We don't want to trouble you with anything. We want to give you peace and honor. But you mentioned that the veterans say, as long as we are not forgotten, then this memorial is serving its purpose. But there's an aspect of that with the long list of names in Washington, D.C., the list of names here, the way that the United States has learned its lesson, you talked about learning its lesson. The lesson we've learned is, oh, now our wars are not fought by GIs avoiding booby traps and ambushes in an unpleasant jungle. It's fought by drone operators sitting in bunkers in Nevada. And so Americans don't die by the tens of thousands, but the colored people around the world get to have that privilege, and they'll have all the memorials in the future, because we won't repeat this mistake of having Americans die. But it doesn't do anything about the problem of war. It might even make war more likely to happen in the future. It's hard to say, but that's a possibility. And I just wonder what your people thought about setting these issues aside, of avoiding controversy, when the controversies about past wars seem to evolve continuously through history, that the things people argue about the Civil War today are a lot different than they argued about 100 years ago or 50 years ago or 150 years ago, that you can't even tell what the controversies will be. How can you plan to avoid them when you're in such a you're treading on such dangerous and highly emotionally charged grounds? How did you contemplate any of these big issues, and how do you contemplate them today in retrospect?
That's a big question. I can't entirely speak to how anyone was contemplating those bigger issues at the time, since I was not personally there. If you look through the website that kind of memorializes that the foundation put together around the memorial, they do speak to an intentional focus on individuals, Oregonian individuals. And that was the intent of this memorial, in a context of those individuals having come home and be called names and be treated really quite badly. And it was really about creating a place of healing for those who survived and for their families and friends, to come and not be in this context of hate that came with their direct treatment, right? So it was really more about the Oregonians. I think the piece that you were getting to about war as in the bigger context, what is right, what is not right, the greater significance of impact, loss of lives, other kinds of impacts, was not what this group was tackling. But I think that does get to, I believe, Paul's comment earlier about, is there, any conversation about noting the Vietnamese who lost their lives during Vietnam, and that significant number of people, that's kind of the lesson that you're talking about, I think, is that piece and acknowledging that. And, it would be curious to see if that's something that might be done here or someplace else, to start to remind people of that greater loss. And you're absolutely correct. The more that we take out the American loss, the more it might incentivize our politicians to think war is okay, because we aren't losing as many American lives, while the impacts to the people we're fighting could be more significant when we're, you know, as you brought up, like using drones and other things like that, where there's very little risk to us or to our citizens, but there can be significant risk to the people we're fighting.
Are there any memorials in the world that, with the concept of this is a memorial to the war dead from all sides, where all sides, you know, in America, we had the war between the states, and there were big memorial celebrations, the 50th anniversary of Gettysburg, the 75th anniversary of Gettysburg, where the veterans from both sides got together and had a good time together. Are there any memorials that would be like a context for that kind of a thing, where people who actually fought each other could get back together and try to make peace with each other? And I know that in Utah they have this memorial for the Mountain Meadows massacre, where the Mormons and the settlers' descendants come through and commemorate this terrible massacre that took place there, and try to establish friendship. Is there any of that on an international scale? Maybe even a place where the veterans from both sides could be buried together?
Mm-hmm. And I don't know the answer to that. I would need to hunt around and see if that exists. I would love to see that. That would be a really impactful thing to do, particularly at the scale of, you know, if you're talking about the scale of a war, which is so significant. That anyway, I don't know. So I think that would require some additional work.
I have a question from Nada that I'll read. She says the memorial uses the word men, but were there any women in Vietnam killed or missing?
At my understanding, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding in Vietnam, this is about the servicemen and women who were in combat, and they were all men at the time of Vietnam. Women in combat is a newer aspect to our culture. And so at this time, they were really men that were lost.
And we have a question from Joyce Lackey.
I don't want to take anything from the beauty of the memorial and that comparison of reactions here. I just think that is beautifully done. In fact, I wanted to almost not necessarily contradict Al, but not agree completely. I do think the controversy here was not set aside, and the whole question about the justice of the war was not set aside. But what I would like to comment on just briefly, and Chelsea, you certainly can't resolve this, but the website that you mentioned covers the history of these two men who came back from the Washington Memorial and wanted to do something here. But about 4 times, I think, on that website, it says that these men believed that the controversy here was in support of North Vietnam. I kept reading that and I kept thinking that was a lack of understanding of the controversy here, I believe. And again, that's not anything you can resolve, but I thought it was a very disturbing thing on the website.
Yeah, I can't resolve that. I think that was, you know, the perspective of the group at the time, and maybe based on what the messaging was at the time and why we were there in the first place. There was a little bit of frustration about Jane Fonda in that website, if you go into it. But, you know, whether or not in hindsight, as people have unpacked this, that's necessarily kind of, it's as simple as that. You're probably right. It's probably not that simple, and maybe slightly incorrect.
There's a comment from Susan Pierce, who works in the healthcare field, that I'll read. She said, there were women lost in Vietnam as nurses. So she wanted to make that comment.
Thank you, Susan, that you would be 100% correct in that. I think the memorial is focused on the combat veterans, and that's probably an oversight, quite frankly, that they should have listed the nurses and others as well.
That has happened more than once.
Yeah, I know that an addition was made to the memorial in DC to acknowledge the women as well. And that, again, that was added later. And
It's as a separate memorial, and it's quite striking.
yeah.
I think in today's times, we recognize the value of the healthcare workers, and we would definitely have a different perspective on war memorials in the future. And I'll ask another question, but first I'll tell a little story on my experience with memorials. Back in the late 90s, when I was hosting a syndicated radio show, there was a big controversy about the FDR Memorial in Washington, D.C., and how FDR was going to be portrayed. Was he going to be portrayed in a wheelchair or not in a wheelchair? And we had to mediate that controversy over the course of several weeks and months, and finally came up with the compromise that he was shown both ways at the memorial. So that was an interesting experience about just how passionate people can be on both sides of how. It seems to me that with the Afghanistan and Iraq war, and latest now with COVID, we have a couple of things that deserve a memorial. Has Walker Macy, or has there been talk about those two things being memorialized in any way?
We have not been engaged in either of those things. I'm not sure. I am a little surprised that there isn't something in the works for Afghanistan. But I haven't heard or seen of anything related to that. I think COVID's probably too fresh for anyone to have even gotten their heads around a memorial on it yet, but I won't be surprised if some sort of acknowledgement around that this last year and those who were lost doesn't happen sometime in the future. There's usually a gap in time between the event and when a memorial actually happens, that it's not particularly immediate.
And I do know when I go up to the memorial, I do consider the horror of war, that these men lost their lives, and that those families still don't know where some of their loved ones are. So there is the way that they're doing these memorials, rather than glorifying the war, I think they're looking at the loss. And so it's a beautiful, you are proud, and you certainly should be. Your company did a great job. The United States, or certainly Oregon, has a horrific history of discrimination against people of color. And you did the memorial for the Native memorial. I saw, in your early part of your presentation, there was a memorial there. I'm just curious, do you know of any, a memorial that might say, we are so sorry as a state, as a territory, as a country, for the things we did to the natives that were here, the things that we did to people that moved here who were not of European ancestry?
Sure. So I don't know of a specific memorial focused on that. However, I am currently actually wrapping up a project in Eugene for their waterfront. And within that, we have a series of their interpretive elements, but they are to some degree kind of in a memorial of sorts, and they're based on the different communities from Eugene. The thing that's really, really important today that I think even historically we weren't very good at is actually engaging those communities in that, because so for Eugene, we have one element within the waterfront park that we worked with their Black community, many of whom have been, multi-generational, have been living there for even before it was technically legal for them to live there, because of the unfair rules around the state. And we worked with them very directly on how to acknowledge some of the lands along the waterfront that were historically those Black communities. And to do so in a way that wasn't candy coating. I think we've often seen memorials or interpretive elements about particular groups that seem to highlight something really cheery about them. Yeah. And that can do a disservice. Now, so we worked with the Black community in Eugene to develop that in a way that they felt that it was proper acknowledgement, respectful, and we had multiple sessions with them to work through the wording and the imagery and everything else. So that was that. At the same time, we also have acknowledgement in that same park for the Native communities. For Eugene, we were working with the Confederated Tribes, the Grand Ronde, and they did not want something to talk about negative treatment. They wanted subjects around their culture and historic culture as well as current. And so that's where it becomes very important to work directly with them and to not assume that what a group wants, a particular aspect. And, and the other thing, particularly with Native Americans, is understanding they are very different. There are many, many different groups. Due to white settlement, they were forced to be together. Many of those were tribes that didn't get along and are now forced into one group. And so it's also, particularly with Native Americans, it's very important to be talking to the right tribe, to the right groups, and they may have very different ideas about what they want to see. So in any case, I haven't seen a particular, like, boom, here's the memorial and here's the acknowledgement, but I have been seeing more and more within communities doing isolated acknowledgements, and it's always best when they're working with those groups to make sure it's as that group, at least the people who are in it today, would like to see it.
As I was looking for the website just now, I saw that there is at least one other Oregon Vietnam Memorial in Salem. And I was wondering if you had interacted at all with them in devising how this would be different than theirs, et cetera.
We have not. And I stumbled upon that as well because I wasn't aware that they were doing anything. I don't think it's been built. I'm not totally positive, but I don't think it has. Just looking at the imagery, it appears to be kind of a series of gardens, each of which might be sort of a replica of different environments or aspects of the war. Just from what they sketched, it sort of looks like they're kind of creating a more lush sort of jungly areas, more plaza spaces, and kind of like a series of different environments that you move through. So I don't know what the status is of that one.
Thank you.
Chelsea, this was a fantastic presentation today. Very informative, very moving and inspirational at the same time. 3 things not easy to pull off. You pulled it off so well today. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you for having me. You all are such a wonderful group.
As a token of our appreciation, we have a small gift that we offer to our speakers, and David DiNucci usually holds that up.
Yeah, I think you're talking about this. We send you a mug to just remember us and find your talk on our website. So
yay, I want that.